The world is watching right now how President Biden responds to Putin's nuclear threats and the global energy crisis. And for more on this, we're joined by former Pentagon official and senior fellow for naval warfare and advanced technology at the Heritage Foundation, Brent Sadler. Brent, great to have you with us. And I want to start with this. Was President Biden wrong to use the term nuclear Armageddon?
I think it's unhelpful, and to be kind. And I don't think it's actually a correct characterization of the dynamics that are at play right now in Ukraine. What's most likely, and it's extremely low odds, because it certainly doesn't serve Russia's geostrategic goals if they were to use a tactical nuclear weapon. And even in the battlefield, it has limited utility.
What would you say is the probability right now that Putin could use a nuclear weapon?
It's certainly not zero. It never really has been. But in this early on in this conflict, in the invasion, there was a period of time just north of Kyiv where it looked like a large portion of the Russian army was going to get surrounded and cut off. That's what's called a strategic loss in a conventional fight. And that strategic consequence could have been a circumstance, according to Soviet and Russian military doctrine, where the use of a tactical nuclear weapon would have been possible or could have served some military utility. They didn't do that. They were able to evacuate out. And as you look across the battlefield and the way the Russian and the Ukrainian forces are distributed now, it doesn't look like that's a probability. Of course, Kherson, if the bridges were cut, if the Russians really goofed up an evacuation or the disposition, and the Ukrainian armed forces are able to accelerate their offensive, like we saw earlier, just to the south of Kharkiv, maybe the odds could go up. But again, it's highly unlikely. It doesn't serve Putin's wider geostrategic political objectives and actually would work against him at very limited tactical use on the battlefield.
Yeah, I guess my next question is if, again, even if there was a small chance that Putin does use a nuclear weapon, do you think that the United States would use a nuclear weapon in response? How would the U.S. likely react to this?
Well, first off, there's a lot of very unhelpful rhetoric that's being put out there by senior ex-officials and even some current officials that should know better, quite frankly, and is highly escalatory. One, in the U.S. arsenal, the only nuclear response would be extremely unbalanced. It would be a city killer type, and that would be a tremendous escalation. Number two, the United States is not directly, nor NATO directly affected or in the conflict. There's no obligation either because Ukraine is not a NATO member. So for the United States to, under the guise of responding to a tactical nuclear weapon use in Ukraine, to directly get involved in the conflict would be an extreme escalation and is not necessary. Better to demonstrate and to put on the table longer range strike capabilities being made available to Ukraine for them to respond as appropriate to a Russian escalation.
Yeah. Is there any chance that the U.S. would know ahead of time if there was a plan by Moscow to use a nuclear weapon?
So this question's been posed several times to the Pentagon spokespeople, and even with my contacts in and out of government that follow this much more closely. There's some assurances given, but again, when it comes to tactical nuclear weapons in the Russian arsenal, it's hundreds of them, if not several thousand. And it's extremely difficult to have the type of exquisite intel and insight to monitor not only just the intent to use them, but also the disposition of these weapons. So I'm very skeptical that we would have the type of forewarning that we would want.
You touched on this earlier, but I want to flesh out this point a little bit more. Is there any military value in using a nuclear weapon on Ukraine? Is it a weapon of war or is it a weapon of terror?
So Russian doctrine treats it as a weapon of war. Putin in Moscow has to treat it as also a geostrategic weapon with political ends in mind. And so far, he has miscalculated on every level the reaction of the West to unify against him. And it's actually troubling also with his last partner in Beijing as well. So I don't see any pressures or any opportunity that really makes it beneficial to use it at that level. At the tactical, it really comes down to the disposition of military forces. If, say, for example, Russian forces were surrounded and cut off in Kherson, maybe a tactical nuclear weapon might open a corridor that they could be able to evacuate out of, but the rivers, the geography don't really make it something very useful. And the way these forces are engaging each other, so distributed and dispersed, you're talking numerous, if not just one or two, but numerous tactical nuclear weapons to have the effect.
All right, Brent Sadler, we're going to have to leave it there. We appreciate you being with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
No crooked establishment.
None of that twisting the
truth.
No talking down to me.
Don't tell me how to think.
Don't tell me how to think.
Don't tell me how to think.
I trust Newsmax.
Newsmax.
They don't tell me how to think.
They let
me decide.
Newsmax.
real news
For real people.